Welcome back to another deep dive. I am honestly thrilled you are here with us today because we are tackling something that feels, well, it feels a little bit like a genre-bending movie script.
It really does. It has a bit of everything.
Yeah, we've got psychological thriller elements, we have this sort of spiritual comedy of errors, and we have a straight-up detective mystery involving a psychic target that went missing.
Except it didn't actually go missing at all.
Right. It just moved.
It moved in a way that challenges our entire understanding of how perception actually works. We are going to be looking at the difference between what we think we are hiding from ourselves versus what we actually know deep down.
It is going to be a wild ride. But before we get into the mystery of the day, we need to set the scene properly and get a very specific piece of housekeeping out of the way. We need to declare up front that this podcast will be distributed free of charge on all major platforms for educational purposes.
That is correct. We are here to learn, to explore, and to really unpack this. And for those of you who are the type to follow along with the text, which we highly recommend you do, the specific source material we are analyzing today is session 317 of the early sessions, book 7 of Seth Material.
And the date of record for that one?
That is February 6, 1967.
February 6, 1967. Okay, so I want you to picture this. It is a Monday night. It is roughly 8:45 p.m. We are in Elmira, New York, in the living room of Jane Roberts and her husband, Rob. Now, for anyone just joining us, Jane Roberts is the medium for the personality essence known as Seth.
Right, and Rob is the scribe. He is the one furiously taking notes in his personal shorthand while Jane is in this trance state.
And the vibe in the room that night is, well, it's distinct. Rob makes a note in the transcript that Jane's eyes are wide open, which is standard for these sessions, but he specifically mentions they look very dark.
Which can sound a little ominous.
It does. It sounds like the start of a horror movie. But then, in the very next breath, Rob describes the mood as very jovial. So you have this intense, wide-eyed trance state, but the energy isn't heavy or scary at all. It is light. It is happy.
And that contrast is actually the perfect setup for what Seth talks about first, because he kicks things off by addressing Jane's state of mind directly. He asks, "What have we here?" "A joyful heart. A grateful Ruburt."
And just to clarify, Ruburt is the name Seth uses for Jane's larger identity.
Exactly. And when Seth flags a grateful Ruburt, he is pointing to a massive shift in her internal landscape. This isn't just, oh, I had a good day today. This is a fundamental change in her psychology.
Let's unpack that a bit. Because usually when I think of psychic trance work, I don't necessarily think grateful. I think exhausted or maybe burdened. Why is she so grateful here?
She is grateful because she has finally stopped fighting herself. Seth explains that Jane has learned a very hard lesson, but a deeply necessary one. And I want to highlight the mission here, really, which is to understand this pivotal moment in her development. Seth says that the ego cannot set itself up against the inner self.
The ego cannot set itself up against the inner self. That sounds like something that should be etched in stone somewhere.
It really does.
But let's be real for a second. What does that actually look like in practice? Because I feel like my ego sets itself up against my inner self about 10 times a day.
Oh, absolutely. We all do it. But in Jane's case, it was about armor.
Armor.
Yes. Seth goes into this deep analysis of Jane's personality structure. He notes that years ago, Jane developed an objective manner. She cultivated this persona of being very logical, very rational, very objective.
Which makes total sense. I mean, she was a writer in the 1960s. She wanted to be taken seriously.
Yeah.
She didn't want to be seen as some flighty mystic.
Precisely. She feared her own spontaneity. She feared that if she let go, she might be seen as too much or irrational. So she built this armor of objectivity to protect herself.
I think you, listening right now, can probably relate to that. We all put on our professional suit or our adult face so we don't look crazy or overly emotional. It is a survival strategy.
It is a survival strategy, but Seth uses a really powerful and slightly suffocating analogy here. He says this objectivity became too strong an armor.
Too strong.
Yes. He says it threatened to suffocate her. The armor worked for a while to make her feel safe, but eventually it became a cage. It was blocking her creative flow. It was blocking her psychic flow. It was literally choking the life out of her spontaneity.
That is a terrifying image, honestly. You build a suit of armor to stay safe, but then the hinges rust and you just can't breathe anymore.
Exactly. And Seth says the emergence of these psychic abilities, the sessions themselves, initiated a necessary overhaul of personality. And the ego protested. Of course it did. The ego loves control. The ego loves the armor because the ego built the armor.
So the ego's freaking out, thinking, if we take this off, we're going to get hurt.
Right. But Jane finally reached a point of surrender. She realized that the armor wasn't protecting her anymore, it was hurting her. And now that she has accepted the inner self, the armor is gone. Seth predicts that because she is no longer blocking the material, he will have a much freer voice to counsel them.
So the joyful heart Seth mentioned at the beginning, that's the feeling of taking off a really tight shoe. Or taking off a corset that's been laced too tight for 10 years.
That is exactly it. It's the relief of alignment. Seth notes that the cure is permanent, as long as she actually utilizes what she has learned.
I just love that idea, that our unhappiness or that feeling of being stifled often comes from us trying to suppress our natural, intuitive selves with this heavy plating of what we think we should be.
It is a profound lesson in vulnerability. Strength isn't about how thick your armor is. Strength is about how open your channel is.
And, we have to credit the source of these insights. All of this material, all these incredible psychological breakdowns come from the Seth Material, which is published by the New Awareness Network.
Yes, their work in preserving these sessions is invaluable.
Okay, so speaking of personality traits and the things we try to hide, this leads us to what I think is the funniest part of this session. Because Seth pivots from this deep psychological analysis to talking about, well, stubbornness.
Yes, he does.
Now, apparently, Jane could be a little bit stubborn. And maybe Rob, too.
Just a smidge.
But Seth does this amazing thing here. He basically rebrands their character flaws. He takes stubbornness, which we usually think of as a bad thing, and he gives it a complete PR makeover.
He really does. He says that the stubborn part of Jane's nature has actually been a characteristic of most of her past lives. But he redefines it entirely. He says, fundamentally, this trait is actually resoluteness.
Resoluteness. I like that so much better. I'm not being stubborn, I'm being resolute. I am definitely going to use that next time I get into an argument.
It is a great distinction, though. Seth argues that resoluteness is a neutral, powerful energy. It is the ability to stick to a path despite disappointment. It is the engine that keeps you moving forward when everyone else quits. That is the positive side.
Okay, so if resoluteness is the engine, when does it become stubbornness? When does it become the bad thing?
It depends entirely on who is driving the car.
Who is driving the car?
Seth explains that when the ego gets behind the wheel and tries to use this energy, it turns into pig-headedness.
Pig-headedness?
Yes, because the ego is limited. The ego is defensive. So when the ego is resolute, it is usually just banging its head against a wall because it refuses to admit it's wrong. It works against the personality.
But when the inner self drives...
When the inner self uses that exact same trait, it ensures psychic and spiritual development. It becomes the grit you need to achieve enlightenment or master a difficult skill.
That is actually really practical. We spend so much time trying to fix our flaws. We think, I need to stop being so stubborn. But Seth is saying, no, don't throw out the stubbornness. You need that horsepower. Just change the driver.
Exactly. Don't lobotomize your personality. Just reintegrate it. If your intuition is driving, that stubbornness becomes your greatest asset.
Okay, so Jane is dropping the armor. She is rebranding her stubbornness as resoluteness. But Seth also gives some very specific, practical advice here for daily life. He talks about lingering symptoms and how to clear them up. He basically prescribes a regimen for, let's call it, psychic hygiene.
Psychic hygiene is the perfect term for it because just like we have physical hygiene to keep our bodies functioning, Seth suggests we need daily practices to keep our energy systems functioning.
What does that look like in 1967?
He specifically mentions two tools, pendulum sessions and yoga.
Let's break those down. Pendulum sessions. Like holding a crystal on a string and asking yes or no questions.
Yes. They had been using the pendulum to tap into subconscious answers. But Seth says this should be maintained not just for getting answers, but as a personal psychic hygiene.
How is that hygiene, though?
It keeps the channel open. Think of it like a pipe. If you don't run water through it regularly, it might rust or get clogged. Using the pendulum gets the ego used to stepping aside and letting information flow from the inner self. It is a drill. It is practice for the ego to say, okay, I'm taking a break now.
And the yoga. I know yoga was starting to get popular in the 60s, but why does Seth recommend it specifically?
He recommends yoga as a daily physical and psychic health measure. He says it will ensure the mobility of the inner personality.
Mobility.
Yes. And this is the key phrase. He says it helps to dissipate resistances before they accumulate.
Dissipate resistances before they accumulate. That is such a good way to look at it. Like, we brush our teeth so plaque doesn't build up. We should do yoga or meditation so psychic gunk doesn't build up.
Exactly. If you don't have that daily practice, the armor starts to grow back. The stress accumulates. The rigidity returns. He wants them to stay fluid, both physically and mentally.
Speaking of mental fluidity, there is a section in this session where Seth drops a massive philosophical bomb.
Yeah.
He is talking about books. Jane and Rob were reading a lot of books on yoga and metaphysics at the time. And he warns them not to take everything they read too literally.
Yes, this is a crucial analysis of the nature of the self. He tells them that books are just groping attempts at inner knowledge. They are translations. They aren't the thing itself.
And he specifically goes after this idea of the subconscious versus the superconscious. Because in a lot of spiritual circles, especially back then, even now, there is this idea of a ladder.
Right, hierarchy.
Yeah, you have the dirty, scary subconscious down in the basement where all your repressed memories live.
Yeah.
And then you have the holy, glowing, superconscious way up in the attic. And your whole spiritual job is to climb the ladder away from the basement and get to the attic.
Exactly. That hierarchical view is very common. It is a very Western way of categorizing things, actually. But Seth dismantles it completely. And I want to quote Seth directly here because this is required reading for anyone trying to understand this material. He says, "You must first of all remember the simple truth, that there is no upper or lower to the self. There is no low subconscious and high superconscious. They are one and the same. You simply seem to know them separately."
They are one and the same.
Think about the implications of that. There is no ladder to climb. You don't have to ascend away from your subconscious to get to the good stuff. It is all you. It is all one unified field of consciousness.
So why do they seem different to us? Why does the subconscious feel lower?
Seth says it is just a matter of focus. It is about where you are shining the flashlight of your attention. The subconscious isn't a basement. It is just the part of the room you haven't turned the lights on in yet.
That is surprisingly liberating. It stops that feeling of, I'm down here, and God or the higher self is way up there. It is all just right here.
It connects perfectly back to the armor concept we started with. If you think the subconscious is a dark, scary basement full of monsters, you build armor against it, you try to seal the trap door, but if you realize it is just you, and it is the exact same stuff as the high self, you can relax, you can take the armor off, you can integrate.
Stop trying to ascend and just realize it's all you.
Precisely.
So Seth is walking them through this personality overhaul. He's giving them tools for hygiene, and he is busting myths about the hierarchy of the soul. It feels very constructive. It feels very therapeutic.
It does.
But then the session takes a turn. We move from this jovial, philosophical vibe into something a little more, well, chilling is really the only word for it. We need to talk about Blanche Price.
Yes. This is the emotional core of the session. And it is where the theory of armor becomes a real-life, painful reality for Jane.
So let's set the timeline for you listening. On February 2nd, a few days before this session took place, Jane received a telegram.
Back when people still sent telegrams.
Right. It was from a friend named Anne Healy, informing Jane that their mutual friend, Blanche Price, had passed away.
And Blanche was an old friend. She was a former teacher of Jane's. It was a significant loss. Jane was upset, naturally. But what Seth reveals is that this wasn't a surprise to Jane's inner self.
No. Seth says Jane was clairvoyantly aware of her friend's death before it occurred, for several months, in fact.
Several months.
But Jane didn't know she knew.
She didn't know it consciously, and this brings us right back to the armor. Jane knew it on a deep level, but her conscious ego didn't want to face the pain of losing this mother figure, so she blocked it. She armored up against the intuition.
And Seth explains that this blocking wasn't free. It had a tangible cost.
A physical cost. Seth says that this blocking was actually responsible for physical symptoms. Jane had been suffering illnesses, discomfort, a general malaise. Her body was reacting to the knowledge she was refusing to acknowledge.
That is scary. The idea that blocking your intuition can literally make you physically sick.
It is a common theme in the Seth material. Energy has to go somewhere. If you block the psychic signal, it manifests as a physical symptom. It is like pinching a garden hose. The pressure builds up and eventually the hose bursts. Seth even mentions that Jane had a dream about a slight stroke on the left side regarding Miss Price, which turned out to be accurate to Blanche's condition at the end. The information was desperately trying to get through in her sleep.
But the relationship between Jane and Blanche wasn't just simple teacher and student, was it? Seth goes into a really deep psychoanalysis of their dynamic.
It is a fascinating blend of Freudian and conversely, Jane viewed Blanche as the mother she wished for.
A mutual substitute mother and daughter dynamic.
Yes, and Seth notes it was a complex dynamic because of a confusion in sex identity. He mentions a sexual charge on Blanche's part.
Which, in 1967, between two women would have been very, very repressed.
Extremely repressed. But, and this is important, Seth says Blanche transformed that energy. She didn't act on it destructively. She used that charge as a propelling action of many beneficial deeds, helping hundreds of students.
So she took that unexpressed energy and sublimated it into teaching, into helping others.
Exactly. It is a very compassionate view of human complexity. Seth isn't judging the sexual charge at all. He is just observing how the energy was moved and utilized.
But then Seth zooms out.
Oh,
Way out. He doesn't just stop at this lifetime. He drops a past life connection that is completely unexpected.
it really is.
He talks about Blanche Price and Anne Healy. Now remember, these are two elderly female teachers living in the mid-20th century. Very respectable, very proper.
Yes.
And Seth says they were connected in a past life as Prussians.
Not just Prussians. Seth says, in one, Miss Healy was a friend, a general in a Prussian war. They were both Prussian.
Two little old ladies were once Prussian generals.
It is fantastic, isn't it?
That is the kind of detail that makes me love this material. It just shatters your assumptions about people. You look at a sweet old lady in a cardigan, and Seth is essentially saying, yeah, she used to command a cavalry regiment.
It reminds us that we play many roles across time. The personality is incredibly fluid. The gentle teacher today might have been the fierce warrior yesterday, and the bond remains. The relationship continues, just in a different costume.
So does the stubbornness of the Prussian general become the resoluteness of the school teacher?
Exactly. The core energy signature remains, but the application changes depending on the life. It is that same resoluteness we talked about earlier.
This is all fascinating, but we promised a detective story at the top of the show. And this is where the deep dive really takes a left turn into the Twilight Zone. We have to talk about the envelope experiment.
Ah, yes. Experiment 83.
So, Rob and Jane had a routine. Twice a week, Rob would set up an envelope experiment. He would put a target object in a sealed double envelope, and Seth, speaking through Jane, would try to describe it.
It is a classic remote viewing test setup. The goal is to prove that consciousness can see things the physical eyes cannot see.
Right. So for this specific session, Rob's target was a note. A specific note Jane had written to him that morning in red ink. He found it on the table, sealed it up between cardboard and double envelopes, and sat down, expecting Seth to say, I see a note written in red ink.
That was the expectation. Simple. Straightforward.
But that is not what happened.
Not even close.
Seth starts describing, well, let's look at the list because it is weirdly specific. He sees a connection with a grave. He sees a large office building in a city like New York or Baltimore. He sees oval brick arches. He sees a dark wooden door where a letter emerges. He mentions the name Spencer. And he sees black button shapes.
And Rob is sitting there looking at his notes thinking, what is going on? This has absolutely nothing to do with the note on the table.
It sounds like a total miss, a complete failure.
It does. And in a standard scientific test, it would be marked as a failure. The researcher would pack up and go home. But this is where it gets interesting.
Tell us why it wasn't a miss.
Because Seth was describing a letter, just not the one in the envelope.
Okay, wait. So Rob put a note in the envelope on the table, but Seth was reading a completely different letter.
Yes. He was describing a letter Jane wrote that exact same morning. But it was a letter to Anne Healy regarding the news of Blanche Price's death.
So Rob put a mundane note in the envelope, but Jane's mind and Seth's focus was drawn to this highly emotional letter she had just sent to a grieving friend.
Exactly. In parapsychology, this phenomenon is called displacement.
Displacement.
Imagine you are trying to tune a radio to a specific news station. That is the note in the envelope. But a block away, there is a massive rock concert happening. That is the emotional letter about the death. The radio picks up the concert because the signal is just so much louder.
The psychic radar locked onto the loudest emotional signal, not the closest physical one.
Precisely. Seth says explicitly that the emotional effects of the letter to Miss Healy superseded even those of the test object. Psychic ability follows emotional intensity, not physical proximity.
Okay, let's verify the details because this is where it gets spooky. If this was displacement, the details should match the rock concert, the Anne Healy situation. Let's go through them. Seth mentioned the city was Baltimore.
Correct. Anne Healy lived in Baltimore.
You mentioned oval brick arches.
Rob later verified that Anne Healy's house had arched windows.
He mentioned the door.
Seth identified it as the door from which she emerged after sending the telegram.
What about the black button shapes? That seems completely random. How do you even validate something like that?
Well, Rob dug into it. Seth connects this to Blanche's death, specifically connected to the dress she wore at death. It is a visual fragment associated with the emotional event,
And the grave.
obviously connected to the passing of Blanche Price.
This is incredible. He is seeing the destination of the other letter. He is seeing Baltimore, the house, the dress of the deceased woman. It is remote viewing, but the target shifted entirely on its own.
It is what you might call a successful failure. It proves that the inner self isn't limited by the artificial rules of a test. It goes where the energy is. And the energy was with Blanche and Anne, not with a mundane note about household stuff.
It really validates the idea that we are all connected in this web of emotion and thought. It is not just about reading an object. It is about tuning into the emotional network.
And it brings us right back to the beginning of the session. The joyful heart. Jane is learning to trust this massive, beautiful web of information instead of blocking it with her armor. She is accepting that she can be in Elmira, New York, and Baltimore at the same time, psychically speaking.
But there is one more detail in this experiment that we skipped over. The name Spencer.
Ah, yes, the mystery name.
Seth said Spencer. And he also mentioned the impression of 1 cent or money, which led him to suppose that money was connected there.
Right.
Now, was there a Spencer involved in the Blanche Price situation?
Not that they could find, but Rob notes in the transcript that the very next day, February 7th, they received $20.
Okay, $20 is money. Who was it from?
It was from a M. Spaziani. That was their landlady's husband.
Wait, Spaziani. That sounds a lot like Spencer, if you are hearing it phonetically. Spencer, Spaziani.
It does, doesn't it? Especially if you consider that names often come through as sound-alikes in mediumship. But Seth actually claimed the name Spencer was a future development.
So it could be the Spaziani money, or it could be something else entirely down the line.
That is the tricky thing with time in these sessions. Seth sees the past, like the Prussian generals. He sees the present, like the Baltimore house. And he sees the future, like the money. He sees it all at once. To the inner self, it is all happening now.
So Rob thinks the experiment is a failure because Seth didn't see the red ink note. But in reality, Seth saw a letter that was traveling to Baltimore, saw the house it was going to, saw the dead friend it was about, and predicted money arriving the next day.
It reminds you to be very careful what you call a mistake. Sometimes, if you get a wrong answer, like Seth did with the envelope, you might just be asking the wrong question. The universe might have a much more interesting story to tell you.
So what does this all mean for us, for you listening right now?
Yeah.
Because we aren't all trance mediums living in 1967. We don't all have Prussian general past lives. Well, maybe we do.
We probably do.
But how do we actually apply this?
I think the synthesis here is really powerful. First, we have to look at our own armor. We need to ask, what parts of ourselves are we suffocating because we want to appear objective or normal? Stop fighting your own intuition.
And realizing that taking that armor off isn't dangerous,
Yeah.
it is actually the only way to breathe.
Exactly. And the stubbornness thing, I think everyone listening can take that up. Stop beating yourself up for being stubborn. Just check who is driving the car. Are you being pig-headed for your ego, or are you being resolute for your soul? It is misdirected resoluteness otherwise.
And finally, the connection to Blanche Price. It reminds us that relationships do not end with death, and that our intuition, if we actually listen to it, knows things long before our logical brain catches up.
We need to practice that psychic hygiene. We need to keep the channel open so we don't get sick from the backlog of unacknowledged truth.
This has been such a fascinating deep dive. Honestly, every time we open these books, I feel like my brain expands a little bit more.
Mine too. It is a completely relaxing, chilling, and funny way to view reality.
If you want to dive deeper into this incredible material, and we really only scratch the surface of what Seth has to offer, we strongly encourage you to study the Seth Material books yourself.
Absolutely. There is no substitute for reading the original sessions. We are just guides, the sources where the magic is. You can find the books at the New Awareness Network website and bookstore.
And we have a specific link for you. Go to sethcenter.com, the early sessions.
That is sethcenter.com/early sessions.
Check it out. Support the work. These books are dense, but they are absolutely life-changing.
And remember, these sessions we discuss are just the tip of the iceberg. There are volumes of this material waiting for you.
Before we go, I want to leave you with a final thought. A little provocative question to chew on while you go about your week, building on what we just talked about.
Let's hear it.
We talked about the name Spencer, or Spaziani. Seth saw it as a future development. He saw a name connected to an event that hadn't happened yet in physical time.
Right. Because time is fluid.
So here's my question for you. If time is fluid enough for Seth to see a future development like the name Spencer, how much of your stubbornness today is actually just you being resolute about a future you haven't met yet?
Oh, I really like that.
Are you holding your ground because you're just being difficult? Or are you holding your ground because a future version of you knows exactly where you need to be and is pulling you toward it?
That is a beautiful thought. Trust your resoluteness.
Thanks for listening. We will see you in the next deep dive.